You all are here on time, so you all get seats, and you get to watch people come in and have to stand and sit on the floor. Apologies for not having more space. We're talking about whether we need to move to a bigger space, but there's some real advantages to this room, so that's where we are right now. I'd like to start with just any sort of announcements about what's coming up. So any activities that we need to be aware of related to GES? Nothing that comes to mind. Okay. There is, for anybody who's particularly interested in forest biotechnology, there's a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on the potential for biotechnology to improve forest health, and that's happening in DC on Thursday and Friday, and there's a public meeting that will be webcast if you're interested. You can Google NASEM Forest Biotech and probably find the site where you can sign up for the webcast of that. Next week, if memory serves correctly, Carolyn Ridley is coming from the EPA, and she's going to be talking about gene drives and risk assessment. So that's our topic for next week. This week, we have Dr. Adam Kokotovich, and he is going to introduce his professional background a little bit more, so I'll just give a kind of personal introduction. Adam came to NC State just this past month in January, moving here from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He did his PhD at University of Minnesota and worked for some part of that time with Jennifer Kuzma when she was there, just out of coincidence. He was one of about 40 applicants for a postdoctoral research position on a project that I have with the Army Corps of Engineers around public engagement in synthetic biology. And he was the top candidate. He's a really accomplished scholar. He's done quite a bit of work in terms of public engagement and scholarship on participatory risk assessment. And so we're really fortunate to have him as part of our GES community. The project funded by the Army Corps is scheduled to go for 4 years, and so if we're lucky, we'll have him here that whole time. And I'm really pleased to be working with Adam. He is a tea connoisseur. I dare you to ask him a question about tea that he can't answer. And he also, you should know, was a cross-country ski racer. So he doesn't just do that for fun, he actually raced it. So don't challenge him to a race on cross-country skis. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. So please welcome Adam.
Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to get to chat with you about some of my dissertation research. I really like the case study that I'm getting to share with you today, and I hope you take something meaningful from it. So I thought I'd just start with my background, because I am new here and I don't know all of you incredibly well, just so you kind of know where I'm coming from. Way back in the day, I did my undergrad actually in mechanical engineering before I pivoted and started down the social science and public policy path. I did my master's in Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy at the Humphrey School of Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And that I actually worked with Jennifer Kuzma there, and I worked on nanotechnology, risk assessment and governance, participatory risk assessment and governance. Then I did my PhD over in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Sciences in the Natural Resources Science and Management program, which is equivalent to the Forestry and Environmental Resources program here. And I took part in an IGER program, not so unlike the IGER program that's here, but ours was on risk analysis for introduced species and genotypes. So risk analysis for GMOs and invasive species. For my dissertation, I looked at 3 different case studies having to do with the contestation of risk. One had to do with risk assessment guidelines. One had to do with the regulation of gene editing. And one had to do with wild rice, which is the one I'm going to share with you today. Most recently, I did postdoctoral research with Professor David Andow and the Minnesota Aquatic and Invasive Species Research Center. And we worked on a project that had 2 goals. One was to better understand how scientific and social uncertainty was hampering Asian carp management and research. And the other was to design and conduct a giant participatory risk assessment that we did. But it's a pleasure to be back here, interacting with the Genetic Engineering Society Center, back in the realm of where my heart really lies, which is the stuff I did with my dissertation research. I'm happy to be done with the Asian carp. That was, I'm happy to move away. So today I'm going to just chat with you about 3 main things. I'm going to provide an introduction to the responsible research and innovation literature. I'm going to then talk about the case study and what insights that we can garner for that literature from it, and what some of the implications are for emerging technology governance. So, to begin, responsible research and innovation is one field. It's similar to, I don't know if you've heard of anticipatory governance or upstream public engagement. These are all similar types of fields that are seeking to do kind of one overarching goal, which is to insert reflection into technological development and governance to guide technology towards desired outcomes and away from undesired ones. So that sounds pretty straightforward. And there's 4 kind of principles that have been offered in terms of how you can go about doing that. 2 of them are anticipation and inclusion. So these are basically the ideas that one should determine possible futures of a technology and of a governance system for that technology, and then determine desirable futures through broad deliberation. So making sure you have the right people in the room to deliberate which paths for technology and associated oversight system are desirable and which ones aren't. A 3rd principle is that of reflection. So that's to identify assumptions and motives behind technologies and to explore their implications. This is to be done within basic research, technology, R&D, and regulation. And it's based on the idea that deliberation and critique will lead to better outcomes. So to identify the assumptions that we're using with regards to a particular technology or with regards to a particular oversight system to identify those and reflect upon them will help improve them. And finally, responsiveness or just integration, seeking to incorporate the insights that you gain through anticipation, inclusion, and reflection into the decision-making for technology and governance. So to put it in more of a graphic form for those who are visual thinkers, it's interesting now that I'm speaking this week after our speaker last week, because she talked about the relationship between kind of basic scientific research and technology R&D and the release of a technology, and talked about how regulation is actually pretty limited in the scope of what it looks at, right? So it looks at anticipated human health and environmental impacts. And what responsible research and innovation and similar literatures are trying to do is to really think about what it means to insert reflection within all stages of a technological development process. And to do so based on anticipated human health and environmental impacts, but as well as societal impacts. What are the ways that these technologies could be influencing society in good and bad ways? And also to include the question of social values. So the recognition that within basic scientific research and technology R&D, there's a bunch of embedded values concerning what's desirable and what's undesirable. And the more that we can engage society in some of those questions and deliberations, the more just and better outcomes will result. Okay. So as this area of literature has kind of established, there's been a couple of interesting areas of tension or questioning that have resulted. There's been many, actually, and I'm going to just touch on a couple because they're relevant for this case study. One is the question of perspective. So whose views and values are informing these processes? And these scholars and others, these authors, have argued that it's important to stay open to alternative worldviews, priorities, and problem definitions as we're designing and using these processes. Second is this question of non-innovation. So is innovation actually needed? So when we're doing responsible research and innovation, can the goal of innovation itself be questioned? So this relates to the realization that innovation is not the only path to solving societal challenges and policy problems. And it's important to keep that in mind and to allow one of the outcomes of these processes to be the decision not to innovate. Okay, So with that kind of overarching set of ideas to keep in mind, I now get to chat with you about the wild rice and genetic engineering issue, which is an issue and near and dear to my heart that I could talk about all afternoon. But I have a short amount of time to share it with you today, so I'm going to focus on, yeah. I'm going to focus on trying to touch on the points that are really relevant for the discussion of responsible research and innovation. So what does this case study have to show for that field? Okay, so as a way of beginning, the following is a statement from six of Minnesota's Ojibwe nations, a statement they put out. They said, Menomen, which is the Ojibwe word for wild rice, is an inherent part of being Ojibwe. The importance of Menomen to the Ojibwe people cannot be overstated, as it holds a central position in the lives and rich history of the Ojibwe people. It is more than just another grain or crop. It is a cultural resource of indescribable importance. And we're going to touch more on a lot of these issues, but it's just important to start with the recognition of the importance of it for the Ojibwe. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the entire kind of issue that revolves around wild rice and the potential for its genetic engineering, just so you have a general idea of it, and then we're going to touch on key aspects of it in further detail as I go along. So to begin, for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, wild rice is an aquatic grass that produces an edible grain and grows naturally in the lakes and slow-moving rivers of Minnesota, other states in the upper Midwest, and in Canada. It's an annual plant that develops each spring from seeds that ripened and fell into the water the previous fall. And ecologically, it provides a key source of nourishment and shelter for many fish and bird species. For the Ojibwe, it's a sacred plant. It's actually part of their migration story. Their prophecies foretold that they would travel to a place where the food grows on the water. And so they started off actually living in the eastern United States, and they made a large migration to the west and settled in the Midwest. It's important to them in the past and currently, both spiritually, culturally, and economically. It has been and remains a key part of nourishment to get through the long, cold Minnesota winters. It's a very, lots of important vitamins and minerals actually within wild rice. So, the first interesting bit of this issue concerns the cultivation of wild rice. Now, this happened in the 1960s and 70s. The story goes that some European-American white men who served in World War II and were stationed over in Asia saw rice paddies there and came back to the US and thought, why can't we make wild rice into a commodity crop like white rice? They tried to do so themselves, but it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And so eventually they turned to the University of Minnesota and researchers there, who in their land grant kind of ethos agreed to help them do so. And they worked for a long time and eventually came up with a cultivated variety that instead of growing naturally in lakes and rivers, could be grown in paddies like white rice. So they were seeking to modernize production in terms of allowing it to be harvested. They drain the paddies and then it can be harvested with a combine. It can, being grown in paddies allowed it to use fertilizers and pesticides. So there were also, when this happened, a variety of impacts on the wild rice economics. So after it happened, California became the top producer of wild rice in the country. And it used to be Minnesota, because California is nice and you can have multiple growing seasons and the weather is perfect. 95% of the commercially marketed wild rice is now paddy rice, when before paddy rice didn't exist. The increase in supply led to a decrease in the price per pound that hand harvesters could get for their crop. And natural wild rice stands in Minnesota now account for less than 10% of the global wild rice market compared to 50% in the 70s before the cultivated varieties came on the market. In addition, interestingly, a bunch of labeling laws were also passed in Minnesota as a host of very creative Californian companies started to market their cultivated wild rice as though it was hand harvested by Native Americans in Minnesota. And so Minnesota passed strict labeling laws to ensure that that couldn't happen. The next thing that happened was that in the 1990s, researchers at the University of Minnesota secretly, without allowing it to be known that it was happening, they genetically mapped wild rice. They did this explicitly to aid in the cultivated breeding process for wild rice and white rice. It was kept quiet until it came out publicly, and then there was a whole bunch of conflict and negative reaction to the fact that it had been done and that it had been done secretly. So there was lots of protests. It was very in the national news for a little while. And a lot of these concerns that were articulated had to do with its potential, although it was not currently leading to a genetically modified product, the potential that that research could be used to create a genetically engineered variety of wild rice. So there were concerns about the continued marginalization of the Ojibwe in University of Minnesota decision-making, of the potential environmental impacts on native stands that could result from a genetically engineered variety or from a cultivated variety, and of just the general appropriation of indigenous knowledge in this type of work. In addition, this box is to signify that there was a lot of very nasty kind of conflict going on. So a representative of one of the Ojibwe nations at the time asked the University of Minnesota to provide information on what research around wild rice was happening. And the dean of the college at the time, who was tasked with putting it together, waited 2 years, and then as this representative drove 4 hours down from the reservation, provided him a box of unsorted documents, which I assumed looked something like that, and said, there you go. So the concerns articulated by the Ojibwe were not taken seriously, and it's in that whole kind of messy context that this collaborative committee formed, actually. And so this is a collaborative committee that I participated in and studied, and that I'll be talking more about right now. So, as this was all kind of coming to a head in the late 90s and early 2000s, many wanted to change the situation. And a group formed with the goals to improve the relationship between the University of Minnesota and the Ojibwe, and to protect natural wild rice, and specifically to protect it from the potential harms from genetic engineering. This group was made up of university faculty, staff, and students, and Ojibwe elders and community members. And they did a host of actions to kind of try and achieve these goals, including large symposia and actions within the committee trying to change university research policy, which I'll touch on a bit more later. So what I want to suggest here is that this collaborative committee represents kind of a non-explicit responsible research and innovation exercise on wild rice. So when they were getting going, these literatures didn't exist, so they weren't really drawing upon them explicitly, but a lot of the ideas that they were using and a lot of the goals they were achieving were basically in line with what these literatures are trying to propose. And so I see the approach they took as kind of having 3 parts. The first is that it challenges, the approach challenges understandings of science and risk that dismiss the concerns of the Ojibwe. And so we're going to talk a lot more about that. Second, their approach promotes engagement between the University of Minnesota and the Ojibwe to help foster reflection about how researchers at the university more broadly, should relate to wild rice and make decisions about it. And third, their approach utilizes an understanding or a vision of engagement that requires a consideration of worldview and history. And we'll describe that a bit more too. So when I was studying this as a graduate student, there were kind of two key research questions that I was interested in. The first was, what are the understandings of science and risk? What understandings of science and risk did the collaborative committee challenge and draw upon? And how can lessons from this committee inform responsible research and innovation? I did participant observation. I was a part of this committee and for 3 years at the time I defended, and I continued on with it until I just left this winter. So I've been involved with it for like 7 years. I did in-depth interviews with committee members and document analysis of historical documents and related publications. So, I'm going to discuss now kind of some of the important findings concerning the understandings of risk and science that they challenged, and concerning the importance of history and worldview to their efforts, and I would argue to responsible research efforts more broadly. Okay, so we're going to go over some quotes here that I think are interesting, but I'll be reading them. You can just listen to me. So the first one just helps set the context. So this is a quote from the president of the Chippewa tribe to the president of the University of Minnesota. Now the Chippewa tribe is a governmental organization that represents 6 of the 7 Ojibwe nations in the state. And this was at the time where the genetic mapping first became public. He wrote to the president of the university and said, "We are of the opinion that the wild rice rights assured by treaty accrue not only to individual grains of rice, but to the very essence of the resource. We were not promised just any wild rice. That promise could be kept by delivering sacks of grain to our members each year. We were promised the rice that grew in the waters of our people, and all the value that such rice holds. We are prepared to undertake every legal and lawful measure to protect our interests in this matter. I hope you do not feel we do so merely to stop the progress of general society. We are all too aware of the historical outcome for Indians when the general society feels we are in their way of progress. I assure you, our interest is only in protecting the few rights and advantages that we have granted at such great cost." So, in response to that letter, the university president wrote a letter that included the following, and this is going to begin our discussion of what understandings of risk the committee had to deal with. So the president said, "As you are already aware, our researchers are working on ways to improve certain qualities of cultivated varieties of wild rice. The intention is to make the plant more adaptable to agricultural practices common to cultivated wild rice, such as mechanical harvesting techniques. They have assured me that there is virtually no risk to the wild rice stock native to the reservations." So we're going to analyze that in a second, but I'm going to add a second quote here. This quote was actually from the University of Minnesota scientist who did the genetic mapping, and in describing his understanding of the situation, and the conflict around it, he said, "It depends on what you're willing to accept as a threshold of risk. The possibility of a trait coming in from one of the bred varieties that would significantly alter the wild type is probably not very great, but it is possible, so you can't guarantee that it won't happen. You can't guarantee that a bird won't pick up a seed and take it 20 miles away. So that's where you have the conflict. You've got to agree on some threshold. And in our discussions with the Ojibwe, some people said, well, 1 in a million is too great a risk." So what do we see in the assumptions by these university officials? What are the assumptions within these statements by the university officials? One, by the president, is that experts can assure that there is virtually no risk to the wild stock native to the reservation. Another assumption is that objecting to low probability risks is unreasonable, as you can see the scientists talking about. Kind of this frustration of even 1 in a million chance of this happening is seen as not okay. And you can see in both of them, there's no need to engage with the Ojibwe on this issue. So when we think of the inadequacies of these assumptions, first one that comes up is that risk as we know, is both a function of probability and consequence, or exposure and effect. So just because there's a low probability risk doesn't mean that the consequence couldn't be so high that the risk would be considered significant. So if you consider a plant sacred, and there's a 1 in a million chance that that plant could be negatively impacted with a severe consequence for your people, that risk is going to be high, even if it's 1 in a million, especially if the risk is being taken to improve cultivated wild rice that you don't actually support. Second is that there's no acknowledgement of the values-based judgments within the assessment of risk. The idea that experts alone could assess these things. So at the base level, the line between inconsequential change and significant harm, that is a values-based judgment, where change, harm, where that line occurs is going to differ based on who you ask. So to pretend that experts alone can determine that, especially around an issue like this where wild rice is so important to the Ojibwe, just doesn't add up. In terms of the understandings of science, the dean of the college where wild rice was mapped said the following in an op-ed at the time. He said, "The academic culture upholds the rights of an individual scientist to pursue his or her interests as long as that effort is consistent with procedural and ethical guidelines of the university, national accreditation requirements, and federal requirements. This academic freedom ensures that the pursuit of knowledge is not hampered or subverted by political, ideological, or other special interests." So what do we see here, assumption-wise? One is that as long as basic procedural and ethical guidelines are followed, you do not need to consider the implications of research. And within this understanding, there's no space for considering the impacts of the research on the Ojibwe without compromising academic freedom, or without science being hampered or subverted by these special interests. So the inadequacies of this are, one, that science can have negative impacts on communities. Specifically, that the basic procedural and ethical guidelines do not protect the Ojibwe and their interests. And second, that the desired ends of science are based on value judgments themselves, and not all have equal ability to influence them. Okay, so overall, why are these questions around science and risk important to the committee, and I would argue important for responsible research in general? And I think it comes down to the answer to this question. Are risk assessment and scientific research value-free and/or the realm of experts? And do basic ethical guidelines ensure science is not harmful? If you are generally answering yes to these questions, then responsible research and innovation efforts will be very limited, and there's going to be little reason to engage with impacted communities because they're just not relevant. If you say no to those questions for some of the reasons that I discussed, then there's going to be a greater need for and greater potential in responsible research and innovation to deal with the complexities that result. Okay, so the committee, really even to get off the ground, had to challenge understandings of science risk being put forth by the administration that delegitimize all the concerns. So they had to say, no, there's other ways of understanding what's going on here that make it necessary to engage with the Ojibwe around these issues. Once they got that engagement going, then they started to deal with the history of the issue and with the importance of worldview. So the historical context between the Ojibwe and the University of Minnesota is quite problematic and fascinating. The first aspect of it that's relative, if you ask many Ojibwe people what they think of the University of Minnesota, they'll say Albert Jenks. This man was the founder of the anthropology department and believed that anthropology could civilize primitive people. He believed in the now debunked idea that you could determine the race of somebody by measuring their physical characteristics. And to make a long story short, and I can tell the long story later to anyone who's interested, he used that now debunked science to dispossess thousands of acres of land from the Ojibwe in 1915. The second historical context, then, is wild rice cultivation that we already talked about. And we talked about how that was completed to the detriment of native hand harvesters in terms of the economic impacts. And it was counter to their worldview in terms of why you would need or want to cultivate a sacred gift from the Creator. So this historical context is important, was and is important to the Wild Rice Committee. One other aspect of the context, actually, is the discourse that was used at the time of cultivation. So what were some of the people saying who were justifying cultivation in the 1960s and 70s? And in a report that was made by the now DNR to the Minnesota legislature, the following statement was included. The white man will eventually domesticate the grain. To curb the trend by stubborn, lethargic do-nothingness will be to lose the business to another state with vision and the will to prosper its agricultural community. If the Indian is to be raised to a level of equality, respectability, and become a self-supporting part of the Minnesota economy, it is a criminal neglect to let him waste his heritage and make no effort to better the one natural resource that is uniquely his. The Nett Lake tribe, to take one area as an example, could, with proper management of their lands, be a proud asset of the state, totally self-supporting, and devoid of any reason to fear the cultivation of wild rice by their neighbors, whose skins are prone to sunburn. Yeah, it's kind of a, people who are squinting, I think, have the right reaction to that. It's kind of a weird, twisted quote. So what's really being said here? One is that the Ojibwe's use of and relationship to wild rice is inadequate and even backwards. That both the wild rice and the Ojibwe themselves need to be modernized. And it suggests that there's no avoiding commodification and exploitation of wild rice. It suggests that the Ojibwe should cultivate wild rice and treat it as a commodity crop before and more efficiently, in terms of not getting sunburned, than those around them. So we could say that there are many colonizing logics inherent within the views of the people that were arguing for the justification of cultivation back in the 60s and 70s. So what is the importance of history then for this collaborative committee and for responsible research and innovation more broadly? I think, first of all, it helps us understand the contemporary context and helps us understand what tensions are going to need to be navigated when doing engagement exercises themselves. So in this case, grappling with the colonial legacies that caused harm and mistrust, perhaps understanding a community's reluctance to engage, given the history, and also in this case, dealing with the tension between how do you treat wild rice? Is it a commodity crop? Is it a sacred plant? And how do you go about having that conversation at a land-grant institution? Second is that I believe, you can see here, that history can help inform the process of reflection itself. So, how did we end up here? What understandings of progress in science led us not to see or care about the concerns of the Ojibwe throughout the history of their relationship to the university? And I will just point out, this is a theory that I have not looked at, but the University of Minnesota's little motto is driven to discover. And thinking about the motto here, I wonder if we were driven to think and then discover, how much of what the problems here would be different. Here you have think and do. There we just have discover. The think aspect of it, which one could say is really a metaphor for what responsible research can do, is really needed. Okay, so now in the remaining bit of time here, I'm going to discuss the importance of worldview. So the committee, as they got started, needed to challenge certain understandings of science and risk that delegitimize their whole efforts. They needed to begin grappling with the history. So when this committee first met, they spent multiple years coming to a common understanding of that history and of the problems involved. And then they came up with this bridging worldviews kind of framework that they used. This framework involved a variety of steps, but it highlighted the following thing. It highlighted that there's more than one way to legitimately relate to and study wild rice science and risk. So if you're emphasizing that there's many worldviews that need to be bridged, you're moving past the idea that the one held within the University of Minnesota is the only legitimate one. So it really highlights the fact that contestable assumptions exist within University of Minnesota research paradigms. It also highlights the need to learn from each other to foster understanding and determine how to move forward responsibly. So the bridging part. So there's differing worldviews. How do we deal with that fact? We bridge and engage with one another. So some of the key actions that were taken involved bridging within committee meetings, bridging at large symposia that were held. Now these symposia were held every other year since 2009, and I'll discuss them a bit more on this slide. So within the committee meetings themselves, there was a large emphasis on relationships and mutual learning, this bridging aspect. So building trust, coming to common understandings of goals, acknowledging understandings of science and risk in wild rice that lead to potential harm. The relationships were kind of cast broadly, so the committee sought to include a broad group of people, including administrators and the scientists themselves who were doing the genetics-based work, doing the genetic mapping. And a key part of the committee's approach was taking advantage of the tensions that existed within the committee for learning opportunities. Not shying away, not trying to shut them down, but really trying to be curious of them when they did emerge. What's going on here, and how is it indicative of larger tensions in the community, or larger tensions at the university, and even around science and technology in our country more broadly. So a key part of what the committee did was conduct these symposia. These were opportunities for the university, broader university community, to come into contact and discussion and do bridging work with many people from the different Ojibwe nations in the state. So this bridging worldviews approach was put forth in both the agenda and the speakers. So they privileged speakers who acknowledged the history, explored the different worldviews that existed around the issue, and facilitated difficult discussions. There were talking circles at each of these symposia for people to interact in smaller groups, things like that. There was also an experiential learning component, especially in the first two symposia, where university participants were invited to take part in a Ojibwe ricing camp to learn how wild rice was traditionally gathered, and to gather it, and to process it, and to hear a lot of the stories and teachings about the importance of wild rice. So real things that help, scientists or people who have never interacted with Americans in a real way to better understand why it is they relate to wild rice the way they do and have the concerns they have. So as one committee member said, in describing the bridging that takes place at symposia, I come as a person with some understandings and expertise in my way of knowing the world, but I need to learn here as much as you need to learn from me, and I have to be open to being transformed in that. Okay, so my last two slides. One is to just share with you some of the accomplishments and challenges of the committee. There's a ton more that can be said about it and its approach, but Due to constraints, we'll just discuss these couple of things. So accomplishments included helping to achieve responsible non-innovation by directing research away from undesired ends and towards desired ends. So there was an agreement by all members of the committee, including one scientific researcher who had done work on genetic mapping, that creating a genetically modified variety of wild rice is undesirable. And there's actually large agreement by the administration more broadly at the university that that's not desirable. Instead, there's been an effort to think about other ways that university scientists can collaborate with tribal DNRs and other tribal scientific bodies to do research that's desired on wild rice, like ways to protect it, ways to study the impacts of pollution on it, and so forth. I would say a result of the committee is improved relationships between the U and the Ojibwe, even if continued actions by the administration will sometimes strain those relationships. And I could talk more about recent history for anybody who has, there's recent things that have happened that have strained the relationships that were improved for a while that I don't have time to get into. And I would say there's been moderate amount of university administrative support. So there's been funding for symposia, but it hasn't been something that's on the front burner of the president's office or within the colleges. I would say more broadly, it's helping to advance a discussion about what is it to be a responsible land-grant university in the 21st century. And that, I think, has been really useful for those involved and for the broader university community. So some of the challenges, I'll just list a few. The University of Minnesota is so far unwilling to alter its formal research policy to include language about having tribal review of potential projects, or language to say we won't pursue a genetically modified variety of wild rice. There's this question of how to protect wild rice, given that there's many research bodies outside the university who could do research on wild rice that would be deemed undesirable by the Ojibwe. The wild rice market is actually very small compared to most commodity crops, and that's one reason that the majority of the research that does take place is at the University of Minnesota, because it's just, there's not much money to be made relative to other crops. And there's been, due to a host of competing priorities that all people who exist at universities have, limited time, representation, and participation compared to where the committee would like to see. Okay, so I think from this case study and from the responsible research and innovation literature more broadly, we can see that there needs to be a path to non-innovation for these exercises to be sincere and robust. Losing trust removes an openness to nuance, and that is something I can discuss more later if there's interest. And I think it's very clear from the experience here of the importance of which understandings of science and risk are being used, the importance of history, and the importance of worldview for doing these types of responsible research and innovation exercises. So with that, we can chat. I can take questions. Yeah.
Hi. I'm going to try to be fast because I have two questions. So you mentioned as one of the challenges the non-EU University of Minnesota research, the researchers that may get interested in the same in the wild rice. Sorry. So two events came to my mind, and one was when the CRISPR license happened and some exclusion rules were entitled on the grant first, and then the fact that Allergan recently transferred one of their patents to the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, and apparently if a patent is owned by a tribe, they have like a higher standing in legal. I don't understand quite well yet the legal system here in America, but apparently the tribe have a higher ground when a patent is disputed. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts in trying to protect the ownership by using the regular, well-established PI resources that you have right now? The second one...
Let me start with that one first. So I think what I've heard in my conversations with some of the Ojibwe community members involved with this, one is that some within the community would be against, like, are ethically against anybody owning this resource, right? They don't feel anybody should have patent rights to it or IRB protection for it because they feel it's something that should be available to everyone. There's a host of different ways that they're trying to alter the university research policy to kind of protect it. One of them is by trying to discuss what a tribal IRB process would look like. Getting tribal, for things that involve wild rice, having a separate tribal review process to make sure that the research process itself is respectful and desirable and such. But we want to start with your...
Yeah, so the second one would be, how do you, when you're performing a risk assessment, how is it that you translate those chains of, those values that the tribe has and that may not be shared by the entire population in the US, and that are not part of the Constitution, or that are not part as end goals of like a legal instrument?
So there's a growing literature that talks about what a tribal approach to environmental review should look like, right? To try and acknowledge a lot of the assumptions within risk assessment, or the dominant kind of forms of it, that actually go counter to the views and values of many indigenous people. And so there's many different scholars, and I could point you to the literature if it's something you're interested in, who are trying to think about how do we kind of shift the way that we think about risk and about environmental review to allow it to be inclusive of some of the values of the type that you're talking about.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I had sort of an uncomfortable thought here, which is that so my personal sympathies in the case you laid out are probably about where yours are with the Ojibwe. But I guess there was sort of an underlying assumption that they could make a claim to some sort of control or preference over this particular natural resource and its genetics based on their culture or their governmental status. And if I was to try to take that as a general claim and say, do I think that governments should be able to broadly say that this or that organism should not be used by people in a given way? I think my answer comes back the opposite. So was that question addressed in the committee?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of points. You know, like in one of the quotes, there's talk about science not being subverted by special interest groups or whatever, right? And the committee members always talk about, in the larger Ojibwe community, make clear the Ojibwe are not a special interest group. They are a sovereign nation and set of nations that have treaty rights which reserve certain rights. So one of the things within the treaty rights is the ability to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territories. Now that's like straight up government to government treaty, which is different than being a special interest group the way that we generally think about that. So, and those treaty rights were recently reinforced back in the late 90s with a case that had to do with mille lacs and fishing. So there's no kind of question about the fact that this is like a special situation that's unique to tribal entities because of their sovereignty and treaty rights that they've established. So that speaks a bit to some of those issues you raised.
Well, so, sorry if I can follow up. I mean, I think there's a lot of sovereign entities that have views on whether or not natural resources should be open to genetic manipulation. So, I mean, I think it's unique within the US, but I don't think it's unique within the world. I mean, we could make a list of 100, 150 countries which would be happy to weigh in approximately similar to the preferences of the Ojibwe in regards to wild rice.
Mm-hmm. So then we would need to engage in a way, I mean, to think about why sovereign bodies would seek to use or not use a particular technology, and the justifications given for that is an important thing to consider. Yeah.
I'd just like to pick up on that and come back to Mexico in terms of maize. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at Mexico's response to genetic engineering of soybeans compared to its response to genetic engineering of maize, it is a cultural value. But whether they can impose that, even though they are the ones who generated maize, right? Do they have the right then to say to anybody outside of Mexico that we shouldn't genetically engineer maize because it's sacred to us?
Yeah. You mean, do they have a rights to people in countries outside Mexico to say you can't use that in your territory or whatever?
Well, I'd like to send that back to you. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's yeah. My question was, I think you're absolutely right that there's super clear treaty, like literal text in this case, but broadly, it seems like the question of whether a government, with or without cultural backing, can tell people not to use a genetic resource is a bigger question that seems really relevant to this question. So I'm wondering if that broader context was brought up outside of the specific language of this treaty for this plan.
Yeah, so at some of the symposia there were, I don't know if anybody is familiar with the taro issue in Hawaii, and that's an instance where that's a plant that is also sacred to the indigenous population there, and there's been, I believe, state laws passed to outlaw the engineering of it. And so we had speakers from Hawaii come and talk at, I don't know, 2 years ago or something. And so I think, yeah, there's lots of connections concerning how technology is used and who gets to decide how it's used and how do we think about the potential for harm and make these types of decisions. And I think, you know, the responsible research and innovation literature and this committee would argue that how we go about that process in each of those instances is really important. Yeah.
I have some questions about the way you're talking about the genetic map of the rice.
Mm-hmm.
You said it was done in secret, so is it actively done in secret? They were like specifically not telling people, or did they just do it and didn't tell people because who cares? And also, as an aside, making a genetic map doesn't guarantee a genetically modified product will come out of it. And I don't even think a genetic map is required to make a genetically engineered organism. So can you talk a little more about the importance of this secret genetic map?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good point to clarify. So I like in your description of the two different forms of secrecy. One is just like, we didn't tell anybody because we didn't think it was important. And the other was, we really knew it was important and knew it was going to be a huge thing, so we kept it secret. And we don't actually know, I don't know, which version of that it was. And really for the impact it had on the community, it doesn't really matter. The result is kind of the same. There was an oversight in terms of thinking of the potential impact this could have and the need to have a conversation about it. So I think...
Well, the impact might not matter, but the resolution, I think, intent would matter in terms of to some sort of agreement and understanding.
Yeah, I mean, is ignorance a useful defense in such a case? I mean, it does matter, right? Like purposely doing something you know to be harmful and being secretive about it is different than just being ignorant of the fact that this matters and you should know better type of situation. But I think for the people, for many of the people who care about this issue, that there's not too much of a distinction there. Both represent a lack of transparency that is harmful, that should not exist at a research university, public research university. So, in terms of the genetic map, yeah, it's true. That's maybe, you could say, one step down a path where a whole bunch of other steps need to be taken. And I think for many people, it was just the fact that that step had been made, and there was no discussion and no engagement around it, which leads them to think, well, what's this stop them from just taking all the rest of the steps?
I still think it's necessarily required step.
No, it's not required, but would you agree it represents a step? Like, if you're concerned about the genetic modification of that plant and somebody makes a genetic map of it, for at least some of them, it didn't matter and was seen as a step. As a geneticist, you may see it completely differently, and those I think are some of the tensions that come up. You have people being like, well, this isn't genetic engineering, it's nothing close, what are you even talking about, you're all irrational and dumb. And then people come back and be like, well, you can't tell me what meaning to give to this.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, but like, you could do that to use it as a way to assess the diversity that exists so that you can then protect it. So it's not, they're
so the
not
use
equal.
of it, I think, was important. It was being used to further the cultivated varieties, which tribal communities already aren't supportive of. Yeah. Yeah.
I just don't think you've got the right perspective on that science calling that secretively done like it was some sort of covert Hollywood movie, right? It wasn't. In that era, getting the money to do it took a lot. They had grant funding from somebody, so they laid out a proposal. Those people knew they were doing it. Okay, it's a competitive area. Doing those sorts of things in that point, people were doing it. Tomato, potato, rice, everybody was trying to do it. You didn't tell people because you didn't want the other people who might be doing it to get their paper out first. That's just the nature of science. That doesn't mean they were subversives out to ruin wild rice for anybody. I think you've just misrepresented that. I think that, I mean, Fred does stuff in his lab, right? And it's good cutting edge science, but he doesn't have to tell people about it when he's, you know, getting started, because there's other people that might try and do that cool stuff with other groups. I mean, science is a little secretive till you have it at the end to deliver it. So, I mean, I just felt like that wasn't quite the right, accurate representation of how that science was done.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. So that's definitely, you know, a viewpoint that has been expressed. And I think, you know, it's that, and it's not my interpretation of it, it's the interpretation that was there in the reaction to it, right? So that I think that the question is, yeah, do scientists have a responsibility to think different, like to exist within that paradigm and not ask questions about it? Or do they have a responsibility, and this is where I think the committee's trying to pivot and get scientists to relate to their work differently, to think about what are the potential impacts of this research and how could it be understood? And who are the people that should maybe be brought into a conversation about the fact that it's happening and how it's happening? To avoid, even just to avoid the ways that it could be understood later on, if you're doing work, I mean, they're not getting upset about doing work on soy or corn, right? They're doing work on a plant that's deemed sacred by a huge, by a significant percentage of the people of Minnesota. And so I think it's that type of question. And I think that's a legitimate question we should all grapple with as scientists, is do like how do we think about our relationship to our work and the potential impacts of it? And do we have a responsibility to reach out and have those conversations, or don't we? And I think there's a ton of different views on that. I think the view of the committee is that it is better to do that outreach. But you can disagree with that, certainly. Yeah.
This is more of a clarification question.
Yeah.
When talking about genetic modification, are they mostly talking about genetically modified in the fact of laboratory genetically modified over the fact that technically genetic modification is any time you select two things to breed and think that it's going to be good and continue that strand? So are they just really focusing on the fact of in a lab completely changing something?
Transgenics, and, yeah.
Great.
Any
Well,
final question? We're done.
I think we're out of time. So
I'm
thank
happy
you,
to
Adam.
chat more with anybody.
Thank you all for coming and asking hard questions. That's an important part of our colloquium, and we'll hope to see you next week. People who are in the Thursday discussion, if you want to gather around Adam, he has a couple ideas for readings for Thursday, and we can select one for Thursday.